A word of warning, this podcast explores graphic and disturbing stories and includes some strong language. It therefore may not be suitable for our young listeners or other folks who may find it disturbing. Hello and welcome to a special edition of True Crime News, the podcast. I'm your host, Ana Garcia. Today's case is a deep dive into the Murdaugh family murders at the hands of the husband and father, Alex Murdaugh. Alex was convicted of killing his wife and his son. This family dynasty ruled the criminal justice system in rural South Carolina for nearly a century, and who would have expected this ending for such a prominent family? And then all of the dirty secrets about Alex that came out about him cheating his clients out of money that he won for them in lawsuits. Our guest today is Valerie Bauerlein. She is the author of a new book about this case called The Devil at His Elbow. Valerie is also a Wall Street Journal reporter who has covered this case and just about every prominent case you can think of. Valerie, welcome. We are so excited to have you.
Thank you so much for having me.
The thing about this case is, we were all consumed by it, obsessed by it, as I'm sure you were as a journalist. And so much has been written about it and said about it, and the documentaries, and, I'm sure the made-for-television movies. Where did you see the space for a book?
We were all fascinated by it, and it had everything. It was set in an interesting place. There were so many crimes layered on to the core crime of the murder of Maggie and Paul. So there really was a lot to dig into. But what I was able to look at in a book, and I really think I found so many surprising things. The main one being that every crime Alec is accused of and convicted of has an echo in the past. Every single one. So violence against his wife, Maggie. Well, his father, his grandfather, and his great-grandfather, there are echoes of violence against the women in their lives as well. Insurance fraud by the side of the road, or if you remember the Labor Day shooting. The family fortune was created by an act of insurance fraud in 1940. It really is shocking when you look at the original documents and the bank records and everything. His great-grandfather, who was the progenitor of the family, who started this dynasty back when he started the law firm in 1910, by 1940, he was in very ill health. He was dying. He was missing court all the time. His younger son had just taken over as a lawyer in the law firm and was holding court for him. And he was broke. He'd lost everything over the course of the previous 20 years as the banks failed in the Great Depression. So his dying act was on a July night, clear sky, big moon. He was coming home from a poker game at 1 a.m, stops 2 miles south of town in his old Ford sedan, pulls up on a deserted train track. And in a small town in the South, and where a railroad bisects the community, everybody knows when the train comes. Pulls up in front of the train, dead in front of it. They're blowing the whistle. They're trying to get him to move. He leans out and waves at the train that's coming to hit him. This is Alex's great-grandfather. The next morning, the sheriff, who is his protege, the coroner, who is also his protege, they convene like a coroner's jury of men who live within 5 miles of the accident site, all friends of this man. And they hear all the evidence. They hear from the conductor, the engineer. Oh, he had to have seen us. He was waving at us. They decide it was an accident, a wrongful death. And so the family sues the railroad for a huge record-setting sum. And that was the genesis of the family fortune that Alec Murdaugh still was inheriting. So I think that to your question, the room for a book is trying to tie this fantastical story and all of these lies and all of this deceit to how we got here. And we got here from a very long, long line of wrongdoing.
Wow, that is fascinating. I had no idea, Valerie, that basically we're looking at a crooked family with
we're looking at generational rot and privilege. And I think you see it in so many stories that you cover. I mean, families and family dynasties, royal families, Chinese dynasties, they break down on the 4th generation, the 5th generation. Alec was the 4th, Buster and Paul, his sons, are the 5th, because they rot often from the inside. Like when everything is handed to you, and also you're never held accountable, and Alec never was. There was a hole at his center, a moral hole, and it was part of an inherited line of behavior.
That is so fascinating, because that is not something that I've heard. or been discussed. It's all about him. Obviously, we always look at the most egregious here. At least at the center of it would be the inciting incident, as we would say, would be the 2 murders, and that's
the entry point into the story. Like, but then I think a question. I was in court every day. I had the privilege of being there, and towards the end of the trial, there were people lining up at 4 and 5 in the morning, and they'd driven in from Ohio and Florida to South Carolina to hear this case. And I would stop and ask a couple people every morning, like, "Why are you here?" I'm like, well, I just don't understand how a man could kill his wife and son. But I'm from the South, and I worked in South Carolina a long time. I covered politics there. There are Southern families that operate in a certain way. And as I started digging into the old newspapers, the court records, it became very clear that there was a generational pattern that led us to Alex Murdaugh.
Let's get serious. Investing can be intimidating. Sometimes it's easier to just put it off or not deal with it at all. Today's episode is sponsored by Acorns. Acorns makes it easy to start automatically saving and investing for you, your kids, and your retirement. You don't need a lot of money or expertise to invest with Acorns. In fact, you can get started with your spare change. Acorns recommends an expert-built portfolio that fits you and your money goals, then automatically invests your money for you. And now Acorns is putting their money into your future. Open an Acorns Later IRA and get up to a 3% match on new contributions. That's extra money for your retirement. It's important to take charge of your future, and Acorns is a great way to get started. Head to acorns.com/truecrime or download the Acorns app and start saving and investing for your future today. Paid non-client endorsement. Compensation provides incentive to positively promote Acorns. Investing involves risk. Acorns Advisors, LLC, an SEC-registered investment advisor. View important disclosures at acorns.com/truecrime. For those who, and I doubt there are very many of them out there, who are not familiar with the murders of Paul and Maggie, I kind of want to go back to that day.
Sure.
Just to give the context so we can have an even broader conversation about your book and the things that you found. So we go back to June of 2021, which is when everything unravels, when Maggie Murdaugh and her son Paul are found shot to death. And the person who finds them, the husband, father, Alec, he's the one who calls 911. And everyone has played that 911. We're going to play it again because it is just, we now know what a performance this was.
Yeah.
So we're going to play.
At the time when, and I look forward to listen to it again, it was a real like Rorschach's test, right? Different people heard different things even in the moment. So it's strange to listen to it in retrospect.
It is strange to listen to it. And I always say that the 911 call is the very first of the official police records. Mm-hmm. That is when the initial version of anything is told and told in real time to a degree, especially if it's authentic. And this one, I mean, obviously he just sounded with the hyperventilating and the high
pitched voice.
All right, let's play the 911 tape.
It's 4147 Moselle Road. I've been up to it now. It's bad.
Okay. Okay, and are they breathing?
No, ma'am.
Okay, and you said it's your wife and your son?
My wife and my son.
Are they in a vehicle?
No, ma'am. They're on the ground out at my kennel.
Okay, so when you listen to this, he does sound hysterical, obviously. One would be if your son and your wife had been shot. And so much, we covered it initially when it happened. We were trying to wrap our heads around, like, it was described as a hunting lodge. It was like not what you would consider a typical ranch. There was a lot of marshland. And everyone was like, such a violent thing, such a prominent family. I don't think anyone initially believed that Alec, this prominent attorney and businessman, had anything to do with it. Do you sense the same thing?
Well, I remember when I first heard it too. It was released just a couple weeks after the homicide, and it was hard as a I'm close in age to Maggie Murdaugh. You know, our kids are close in age. It was hard to listen to just as a human being because his voice is so anguished and high, and he's breathing hard. And it was hard to know what to make of it at the time. But I made my first trips down to South Carolina in the summer of 2021. And I went to see another lawyer in the case who was early on very suspicious of Alex Murdaugh. And I can remember sitting in his office, and he said, I want to play the whole 911 tape for you. And it was Justin Bamberg, who is an attorney. He's the attorney for one of the attorneys for Hakeem Pinckney's family. And he represents a lot of the victims of Alex Murdaugh. His father's in law enforcement. His father's a sheriff. His mother was a detective. So he has an ear for things. We sat there and listened to it in his office more than once, 2 or 3 times. And then he's like, at the very beginning of the call, what do you hear? And I said, silence. And he goes, but don't you remember that on a 911 call, it starts recording as soon as you call. It doesn't start recording when the dispatcher picks up the call. It starts recording right away. And he said, Alex Murdaugh, for 2 or 3 seconds, is not crying. He's not breathing hard. It's just silent. And then all of a sudden, as soon as the 911 dispatcher picks up, he starts like huffing and puffing. Mm-hmm. So that's always stuck with me. There were Easter eggs early on that something was horribly awry with his version of events that night.
Interesting. And, you know, there seemed to be this like nationwide hunt, obviously, trying to figure out who would kill this prominent family. And then there are all these issues with how do you investigate this case when the Murdaugh family is so intertwined in law enforcement, either the prosecution or the defense of. That to me was like, how in the world are you going to find someone impartial here to investigate this?
Well, and early on, you know, you were talking about Moselle, this family property. It's both less and more than a hunting estate, right? It's enormous. It's 1,700 acres, so it's twice the size of Central Park. But it's also very swampy. A lot of it's impassable, even on a 4Runner or ATV. And there are tons of trees out there, but they're like timber trees, revenue generating trees that they cut down. So it's a hunting estate, and there's amazing hunting out there of doves and hogs and deer. But it's also, you know, it's pretty remote, and it's pretty, it's not, you know, like Dallas, the estates on Dallas or ranches or something like that. But it wasn't an estate. They were very wealthy, very prominent. And then from the beginning, there were no suspects. How does someone kill a wife and son at home on a summer night in the middle of nowhere with no suspects, no clues as to what happened? So it was very mysterious from the very beginning. This book, I kind of wrote it with 2 people in mind. Someone who was aware of Alex Murdaugh as, I heard of this case. I'm not really super interested in it. It seems like a lot to have to get to know. I tried to tell it beginning, middle, and end for that person. So here's why the country was captivated by this. But I also tried to tell it for my sister, who is a huge true crime fan and who knows, she could tell you, she can tick off the names of the Murdaugh's dogs. There's 6 of them. And I wanted the person that knew every detail about this case to find out something surprising every other page or so. I tried to make sure that there was new information throughout the book. And one of the things about the 911 call is, and you've covered crime in courts forever. I mean, one of the first things, like you said, it is the core document. It is the first version of events that's closest to the event. And just like a stove that starts getting cool as soon as you turn it off, that is a key piece of evidence. And that night out at Moselle, it took a couple of hours to get the detectives who were taking over the case to get there. The homicides happened. He calls 911 at like 10:06. And the main investigator, David Olin, the state investigator, doesn't get there until midnight. So the first thing that everybody does is they gather around the first responders, and the detectives, everyone, all the law enforcement that's there listens to that 911 call. And they hear it, and it's confusing. And the lead captain on the scene from Colleton County says to everybody that's huddled up, he goes, I hesitate to say this. I've grown up with his family. I known him all my life. Something's really wrong with Alex. Don't overlook Alex from the beginning, because he was acting so strangely that night. So even in the moment, the 911 call was sort of looked at with side eyes.
That is fascinating. That is. It's and as everyone is scrambling, because everyone's like, oh my God, this is an incredible murder case, and all the news media reporters are scrambling to cover it. then we start finding out all these problems within the family with an investigation into the boating accident.
Yeah.
And then there are these rumors, which I thought were like, this to me was like, my God, that somehow this killing was a revenge for the boating accident. Yeah. And I was like, wow. I mean, is that really where the investigation is going, to everyone who was traumatized?
From the beginning. So I live in North Carolina, but I cover South Carolina. I'm down there quite a lot. And I knew about the boat wreck. I'd been following that story because it was the death of a young woman, Mallory Beach, in this drunken boat wreck at high speed for a long time. Nobody was saying for sure who was driving, because it was Paul Murdaugh, Alex's then 19-year-old son, who was driving. He had I have some access to some non-public hospital records and other documents from that investigation. He had 19 drinks that night.
My Lord.
His BAC was 0.286, and they were driving in a small boat in a narrow, shallow channel. They were driving 28 miles an hour when they hit that bridge, and Mallory went overboard. Oh. And everyone on that boat knew who was driving. But because the young people in the boat were of a lower social status than the Murdaughs. The Murdaughs were all powerful in that region. And these were some kids with blue collar backgrounds. They hung out with Paul partly because he had all the toys and all the properties and the beach house and the river house and the hunting estate. And they did not, and all of them have said some version of, we couldn't go up against the Murdaughs. We couldn't tell the truth and live in that community.
But what about the photo of Alec arriving at the hospital, and he puts a badge, right? He puts a badge on his belt.
Even more than that, I remember sitting in the court when Creighton Waters, the lead prosecutor, and I worked in the book for 3 years. And so I've been working on a lot of the history of the family. And when Creighton Waters brought out that badge and put it up on the overhead projector, and then he put Alex's badge, and it was the two badges were Alex's grandfather, who was this all-powerful prosecutor down there from the Roosevelt era from 1940. He was the one that took over. He was the one that sued the railroad for the great grandfather. He took over in 1940. Roosevelt. He stayed in office until 1986. Reagan. And he didn't want to get out then, but the legislator made him retire, else they said you wouldn't get your benefits. You can't work past 72. So he stayed on as a volunteer until he died. That was that badge that Alec had on his pocket that night. And when Creighton put that badge up there, I was like, thank you for explaining to everyone what the story is really about. It is about the great-grandfather. It's about the grandfather. It's about the father, who was very involved in helping cover up the boat wreck. And it was about how Alec thought that he could just walk into that hospital with a badge in his pocket, and all of the law enforcement, you can see it on the security cameras, all of the law enforcement, they bow their heads to him and shake his hand, and double handshake. He puts his arm around him. He was running. He was like a small town mayor, and he was a small town mayor of the ER that night.
Well, I would say it sounds more like organized crime.
Well, and it's funny. The law enforcement SLED is the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division. That's like the state version of the FBI. It's the big investigators. They had been investigating the Murdaughs for a while before the homicides because of the boat wreck and the corruption that was feared to have happened and covering it up. He had been under state investigation without anyone except for Alec knowing it. But they had also run out of town the sheriff in the neighboring county, Colleton County, on white collar corruption, embezzlement charges. And then the local police chief, he charged him with embezzlement. They called it the Low Country Mafia, to your point.
Yeah.
But I will say, in the book, I was able to get Alex Murdaugh's cell phone records for the night of the boat wreck that had not been made public. And if you can take the times where you can see where he was as he's driving from Moselle to Beaufort Hospital, which is in normal conditions, about an hour drive. You can see where he's calling from along the way. He made what should have been an hour-long trip in like 35 minutes.
Oh. And
he had blue lights and siren installed in that Suburban he was driving. He testified to that. And there is absolutely no way that he made that sort of time going less than 80 miles an hour on some of those back roads, 40-mile-an-hour roads. And he was beating feet to get there because he knew he needed to get there first and get all the kids on the same page. Isn't that extraordinary?
It really is. And Valerie, when you said that you were in the courtroom every day, I think back to this image of one of the ancestors' portraits in the courtroom. I mean, come on
They had
now.
to remove it. That's there's 4 generations of Murdaughs that we really talk about in the book. Randolph Sr., who died on the train tracks, he died in 1940. His son, Randolph Jr., took over in 1940. And it was his portrait that was on the back wall of the courthouse there. And Alec had actually spoken at the dedication of that portrait, which is extraordinary. And he's holding a cigar in his hand because he either always had a chew of tobacco or a cigar when he was in the courtroom. And it just was menacing. And the judge, Judge Newman, decided to take the portrait down over the course of the trial. But that means when Alec was sitting up there in the stand in this very tight courtroom, his direct line of sight was the empty white rectangle where his grandfather's portrait should have been. Isn't that incredible?
Yeah, that really is.
One of the things, that courtroom is from the 1820s. It's beautiful. It was designed by Robert Mills, this legendary South Carolina architect who also designed the Washington Monument, like so many of these beautiful buildings in DC. And I can remember when I realized we walked in and out of this one little tight hallway every day, and you're chit-chatting with the Murdaugh family and all the lawyers. And it was in that exact hallway that his grandfather, the one who was in the portrait, his grandfather accepted a cash bribe in that hallway in 1955. That was the subject of a federal. He was charged by the Department of Justice with running the largest bootlegging ring in the South. He was on federal trial for weeks, and with the cash bribe was accepted in that same little courtroom right outside the courtroom. So I think it's just like that in the South in particular. History is really never even below the surface. It's like the surface of the water. It's right there at every turn.
Oh my goodness, a bootlegger on top of it.
A bootlegger. And that has echoes to Alec. You remember Alec was charged with drug trafficking along with Cousin Eddie,
oh, that's right, Cousin Eddie. My God, that twist.
and people that listen to the Netflix will remember they had some video footage of small planes flying into Moselle, and the driveway that linked the big house at Moselle and the kennels where the murders took place was a runway, because they had a little hangar out there, and it was long rumored to be a place where drugs were flown in and out. So yeah, the family, there's nothing new under the sun. It's just Alec was a bigger, badder, meaner version of the past.
It just sounds like Miami Vice, except in a swamp.
Well, and there's a great book called Jackpot, and it's about it's by a writer named Jason Ryan, who also was in the courtroom and wrote a book about this case called Swamp Kings. But Jackpot is about the Low Country, the nature of drug running in the early war on drugs in the late 70s, early 80s, because in these swamps, and particularly out in the waterways around Beaufort, where Mallory Beach was killed, there are all these little islands. And it's a place where a shrimp boater can come in with a load of whatever in their hull, pull up on these private islands, drop a load, go, and then kind of easily, there was a whole bunch of smuggling that took place on these private islands and among these shrimpers. And Alec shockingly owned, I think, 9 of these small private islands. And his best friend was a shrimper who was charged in these cases named Barrett Bowler. And it was Barrett. I'm sorry, this is also interesting to me, but Barrett Bowler is the guy that was his best friend who he robbed on his deathbed to wrangle Moselle away from him. Moselle belonged to Barrett Bowler, and Alec effectively stole it from him on his deathbed.
Oh, how horrible.
It's pretty abominable. I mean, unimaginable, I think, to people.
Okay, so there are a million ways I want to go here because I have so many questions for you.
Oh, no, I think that whole saga is about here.
I love that. Valerie, talk to me about Maggie, because so much has been written about the sons, Buster, Paul, right? Yeah. The obsession with this. Not that much about Maggie. Tell me about her. How does she fit into all this?
I would say, the book has been out for a couple weeks, and I've had the privilege of talking to a lot of people about it. And that is the one question I always get. What was
Really?
Maggie like? What was Maggie like? Other people want to know, what did Buster know, the older son?
Oh yeah,
That's
I do, but it's like, we're so obsessed with Buster
yeah.
the prized child, it seems the favorite one. But it's like,
No, he was Maggie's favorite. So Maggie, and families are funny,
yes.
but Buster was Maggie's favorite. Buster went to college, was in a fraternity, always had a pretty girlfriend, went to law school until he got kicked out for plagiarism. But Buster was going to be the one to continue that family legacy. Paul was a wild man from the minute he entered the world. I mean, he got kicked out of 2 middle schools and in a place where his grandmother was the head of the school board. I mean, it's very hard in Hampton County to get kicked out of public schools, but he managed. He was a hellraiser, just like his dad. And Alec loved it. There's a story in the book where Paul, when he was young, I think he was 7 or 8, had a BB gun and he was shooting BBs at the yard man.
Oh no.
And
That's
Alec
horrible.
laughed. He thought it was just hilarious. There's all these stories where Mallory Beach's mom told me a story about being at a baseball game, because everybody knows everybody in that community. And her nephew was playing on the same team as Buster, the older son. And Paul, who was young, he was single digits, is climbing up on top of the dugout and jumping around and waving his arms and bothering all the other parents. And Alec and Maggie are laughing, but they had such power in that community. I think even the law firm might have sponsored the uniforms that year for the Little League. I mean, nobody said anything. Paul was just, Mark Tinsley, who's one of the main characters in the book, the lawyer for the Beach family, knew Paul since he was a little boy, spent a lot of time with him. And he said, Paul was feral. They never raised him. And he really blamed Maggie and Alec for that, not Paul.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, yeah, if you don't set
And I think
boundaries.
that's the thing with Maggie. I think I tried to do 2 things with both Alec and Maggie. Is Alec, we know him such a deeply bad, evil person. I think evil is a hard word to use in this day and age, but I think he was evil.
Yeah.
And so I tried to also explain he was loved as well. He was feared, but he was loved. He was the prom king in high school. He was the quarterback of the championship winning football team. He was Mr. Popularity in his fraternity at USC. He never stood in front of you to shake your hand. He always put his arm around you. He's 6'4", 260. Alec was larger than life, and there were parts of being around Alec that people liked. Mm-hmm. And similarly with Maggie, she was such a cipher. We never really, we heard from her sister one day on the stand, but the family was not present. They have not wanted to speak publicly about her. And so I really tried to talk to as many of her friends and people that knew her as possible to flesh her out more as a human being. She was very funny. She was always very beautiful. She liked being out, but she was more introverted than Alex. You would commonly find her in a corner of the kitchen talking to 1 or 2 people rather than out in the mix. But towards the end of her life, she was very blue. If you think about what was happening, the golden boy, Buster, had gotten kicked out of law school his first semester for cheating. And they were paying a fixer $60,000 to get him back in. Paul had been in this drunken driving wreck after he had wrecked multiple. I've tried to lay out for you at least 3 other times that he had drunken wrecks that his parents bailed him out of. And he kept drinking. His health was getting so bad. The week before he died, he texts his parents a picture of his feet. They're so swollen he can't get his shoes on. He's like, fine, I'll finally go to the doctor, because he was having heart issues at 22 years old.
Oh my God.
He was in poor health. And the weekend before, June 7th was the day of the homicides. Memorial Day weekend, Paul got pulled over for drunken boating on the family boat. And the local officers said, son, haven't you learned your lesson? He said, can I use your phone? They call Alec, and Alec makes it all go away a week before he's killed. So awful. I think what I'm trying to say is Maggie was very blue. She knew that Buster his life was falling apart. Paul was a mess, and she had started to suspect that Alec was not telling her the truth about their finances. And there you can see, I had the benefit of 10 years. I have a spreadsheet of 10 years of their spending from the main account that they used on a daily basis. You can see when they get sandwiches at Subway. You can see when they pay their country club dues. They were overdrawn dozens and dozens of times by $10,000 or $50,000. And she would have to call Alec to call the bank and have them front more money. So she knew something was off with their finances. And I think all that is to say she was depressed towards the end of her life. There's no doubt about that.
So here's the part that I can't reconcile. Where did all the money go?
Isn't that interesting? Yeah, honestly, that bedeviled me too, because I worked for the Wall Street Journal. I covered finance for years. There's got to be a reason. And when you look at the numbers, the spending is outrageous.
On what?
On everything. So they would take they were huge season ticket holders for Gamecock sports, like right on the 50-yard line and right center court. And they would go to all the games. And then they would take like private charter planes to see them play out of state at places when they could have flown first class. I mean, Alec would spend thousands and thousands of dollars on guns for the boys, on just all manner of, they had so many vehicles, so much farm equipment. They just spent money like it was going out of style. And in a small town, in the South, wealthy families, there are plenty of them. But the wealthiest man in town probably drives a Buick. He doesn't drive, Maggie bought herself a brand new black Mercedes SUV, top of the line, the Christmas before she died. They were living, Golden Goose tennis shoes, Christian Louboutin heels in Hampton, this place where the median income is half the national average. They were just spending a huge amount of money. And some of it is still missing. Some of it, there's no doubt about that. But they spent money almost as fast as it came in the door.
Interesting. And there's so many things I want to ask you, but now I can't help, but I've never truly understood the motive.
The motive to me, and maybe it's just because of spending so long on this case, the motive to me makes perfect sense. And so if the one thing we know about Alex Murdaugh is that the Murdaugh name meant everything to him. And the Murdaugh name was what Maggie married. When they were dating, he was in a fraternity called Kappa Alpha, or KA. It's the Robert E. Lee fraternity. They really do. It's an order set up almost in worship and homage of Robert E. Lee. And so their first big date was to the Old South Ball, where Alec wore a Confederate uniform and Maggie wore a Gone with the Wind antebellum ball gown. And he, when they were dating, he promised her, "You will never have to work a day in your life. I will keep you in the highest of style. We have to live in Hampton, but we'll have a beach house."
But the problem is we have to live in Hampton.
You have to live in Hampton, which is, in fairness, it's a very difficult place to live if you're not from there. There are very few people that are not from there. But she made that bargain, and it was a Faustian bargain. I mean, and she gets to, you think about it, she was 52 years old. Her sons are 26 and 22. Their lives are headed in the wrong direction. Alec is a hot mess. She knows he's using drugs again. She confronted him about using, and he was detoxing the day before he died. That Sunday, they were at a baseball tournament in Columbia, and he stayed in the hotel because he was throwing up and he was too sick to go to the game. The motive to me, money, status, the name of everything, that above all, Murdaugh. And so what was happening that afternoon of June 7th, and you can see it, I've got like an 88-page chronology of every second of his day, what phone calls he made where he was, what phone calls they made where they were. You can see a couple of things happen. The law firm administrator walks into his office around 2:00 and confronts him about $792,000 fee that's missing. Mm-hmm. Huge amount of money that he knows he's already spent, and it is missing. And he had tried to placate her in the past, and she goes, "No, I really need some proof this time. This is a problem." The phone rings. Right then, it's his older brother calling to say their father, Randolph Murdaugh III, is dying. They're taking him to the hospital, but this is it. He's at the end of his life. And in fact, he does die a few days later. And his father had loaned him more than $1 million in the past to get out of similar jams that exist. He'd even texted his father a few days earlier saying, "I need some more money. My dad's going to vouch for it." That happens. And you see him call Maggie. She doesn't pick up right away. And then he gets her on the phone. He asks her to come home. She doesn't say yes. You can see her call her sister, and and the sister says, well, the dad's dying. I think he should go. Maggie doesn't want to go. She decides to go because she feels bad. And she finally texts Alec back like an hour later that she's coming home. Similar with Paul. Paul was not planning to be at home. He was living with his uncle about an hour away in a town called Okatee. Calls Paul. Paul comes home. So it's a Monday night, randomly. He calls them both to come home. They do. They think they're going to go see the grandfather. They never do. And Alex stays late at the office. Instead of going to see the grandfather at the hospital, his father, he's working on the financial information in the Beach case, because it had been almost 2 years and 2 months or more. And he had not turned over even like his bank accounts. And the judge had enough. So on June 10th, just 3 days later, there was a hearing where the judge had said, I want, put up or shut up. You need to show us these financials. And Alec knew any real look at his bank accounts would show major irregularities. So all that is bearing down on him. Plus, he's detoxing the day before, which is a misery. I think everyone in this country has some awareness of opioids through their family or a loved one. It's a hellscape. He's desperate to get pills. And he testified he was back on pills that night. He had a pocket full of pills. So a lot of things were just coming to a head that night.
But he was unraveling. There's no question about he's unraveling. His schemes and scams are unraveling.
Yes.
And, this is the thing about covering true crime. I always say murder is not a problem-solving solution, right? This is not how we fix things. So what I'm trying to figure out here, and it may not make sense to any one of us, but how is killing Maggie and Paul solving his problem?
Mark Tinsley has said this to me many times, because he's a personal injury lawyer, and personal injury law is such a specific part of the law, particularly in a rural Southern community. These guys take a case, the more grievous, the better in their eyes, the worse the injury or the more violent the death, and take a 40% cut of that. And their favorite type of cases are sympathetic widows. They always say, juries give money to Mother Teresa, not Attila the Hun. They want a victim who is sympathetic, who can draw out the emotion of a small town jury. Alec knew all that. And he said to several people, whoever did it had been thinking about it for a long time. I think in the back of his mind, he knew that the way to get his problems to buy some time, to raise some more money, was to become, instead of the object of suspicion, the object of sympathy. I truly believe that. And I think
is so crazy. I have such
but
trouble.
It is, in Creighton Water, you're right that murder does not solve problems. But Creighton Waters said often, the lead prosecutor said often, this was a white collar crime that culminated in homicide.
But I think, and here's my disconnect on this one, Valerie. Like, I get that he's unraveling and he's not thinking straight. I totally get that. But was there any financial gain for him by getting rid of Maggie and Paul? Like something, what happened for a man to do this? He's not a dummy. He's not a dummy. How is this going to fix your problems?
Well, a couple of things. Moselle was in Maggie's name. The beach house was in Maggie's name. So I don't think she was ever going to divorce him. And we could talk a little bit about that. There's a mantra in the family that Murdaughs don't divorce, and that goes back decades. But were she to do so, all the property was in her name. But I think more than that, what the evidence shows is June 7th, everything stops. Nobody asked him about the missing money the rest of the summer. He immediately, within days, is going around borrowing money, raising money to pay it back. And he did. He was able to pay the $792 back and avert suspicion on that over the course while he's grieving. Isn't that insane? He did.
It is. It is.
And so he was covering his tracks. I think the evidence supports that. And the reason this is an even harder step out on the diving board for you, but if you think about Labor Day, what happened the day before the Labor Day weekend shooting, he was confronted again. There was a stray check that he missed, that they found evidence that, in fact, he had, even though he'd returned the money he'd stolen in the first place. He got confronted the Friday night before Labor Day by his brother. They fire him from the law firm. He gets enough pills to stave off withdrawals until he can go to rehab. The next morning, he meets up with his drug dealer to get some more. and comes up with this scheme to kill himself by the side of the road. What he was actually doing, according to Cousin Eddie, and I think there's reason to believe this is true, he was going to stage a fight with Eddie, his drug dealer and accomplice in many crimes, and pretend, and accidentally the gun will go off and kill Eddie. And then he'll say, oh my gosh, Eddie killed Maggie and Paul, and then he came for me and I had to defend myself. Or, whatever version of that there is. And what does all that accomplish? It makes him the subject of sympathy, and not, he was disgraced. He was losing his name. If he gets shot or in an altercation by the side of the road, people feel sorry for him again. Oh my God, they tried to kill Alex Murdaugh,
That
it's
to
bananas,
me
but I
it
think
is bananas.
Yeah.
And maybe that's the problem, that I am looking for. Sometimes things are clear. Now, I'm not saying that by any means do we agree, but let's say the fear of your secret being revealed is always the most dangerous time.
Yes.
And he was definitely in one of those situations. His secret was about to be revealed. However, one would have expected, if you're going to kill someone, you're not going to kill the wife and the son. You might kill the person who's about to reveal your secret, as opposed to them. So this is where, for me, it's lacking.
But the son, think about it though, Anna, the son, Paul had been charged in the death of Mallory Beach. He was, and not
as sternly as he should have been.
Well, but he was facing decades in the South Carolina Department of Corrections, which is one of the most difficult correction systems in the country. It's the prisons are often under lockdown. Many of them are unair conditioned, and it's a hard place to be in prison. And Paul was not a resilient human being. And he knew that Paul was, he bailed Paul out of a drunken wreck 10 days before he died. He knew Paul was not headed in the right direction. So it is unfathomable to kill your child. But in there, Creighton Waters mentioned this term, family annihilator. And you just mentioned how a lot of times, if you're facing the loss of something, that's often where there's a criminal act. There's a perverse world where he could have convinced himself that he was sparing Paul a fate worse than death. And Maggie lived
but
for
he doesn't.
I don't understand.
I know, and I don't mean. And Valerie, I realize we can't really have all these answers. But the one part, the only thing I could think of was, okay, if the properties are in Maggie's name and he needed those properties to sell, flip, leverage to get the money that he owed, and Maggie was denying that could have been.
And that was an element of it too. It didn't come up in the homicide case so much, but in the federal trial involving Russell Laffitte, the CEO of the bank, Palmetto State Bank, there was a lot of testimony about Maggie's reluctance to have an appraiser come out and appraise the beach house property to get yet another mortgage on that and leverage it even further, go deeper into the red. She was just never available. She wasn't returning the appraiser's calls. There is a world in when that makes some sense as well. And a lot of people, there are people in the jury who might tell you, well, I'm not so sure about all the financial stuff, but the kennel video, the video that showed he was down there showed he was lying. So that was enough for several of the jurors to say, okay, the motive is very hard to understand. And the hard part is that Alex Murdaugh, the truth is not in him. So
we may never know.
We'll never know. I did not get to, I'd hoped that I'd get to interview him. I thought I had a pretty good chance, but once he couldn't talk before the trial for many reasons. But once you go into state prison in South Carolina, you may not grant interviews ever. There's like Susan Smith, who's been.
I was just about to say that we've had the same problem with Susan Smith.
Yeah, we never hear from her. And the head of prisons is a source that I've known for more than 20 years. He's former chief of staff for several governors and he was a very good close friend of Alex Murdaugh's in college, actually. And I asked him, I was like, hey, any chance? Is there any? He's like, there's not a chance in hell you're ever getting in there, Val. Right. So, but all that is to say, Alex talked for 2 days on the stand. And
why did he take the stand? And again,
that's a whole other thing.
It is. That's a whole other podcast and book.
And then he was like, and then in Beaufort later, right before Thanksgiving last year, right after Thanksgiving, he was sentenced in the financial. He pled guilty in all the financial crimes. Mm-hmm. And that really put put a bow on a lot of the crimes. And he had a chance to stand up and make a statement, say anything he wanted. He talked uninterrupted for 45 minutes. And it was so wild. I was sitting just, maybe 10 yards from him because I was sitting in the jury box. They had some of the media sitting up there. And he was facing us. He turned to us and started saying, and my grandfather, my great-grandfather, my father, honorable men, and the media has done everything that they can to tear down their names and stuff. And I put down my notebook and my pen, and I just stared at him. I was like, the media ruined your family name? Really? All your criming didn't do it? So I just don't think, I think interviewing him, as much as I would love to have the opportunity, is a fool's errand, because he doesn't understand himself.
No, he doesn't. He doesn't. He really doesn't. I do. You said that you had, you described them as Easter eggs, and I kind of want to make sure that we get a chance to,
Sure.
to hear some of the other I have a million questions for you, but they may not lead to your Easter eggs. So I want to make sure.
No. Well, I do think one of the things, I got a chance. I had the luxury of some time. I think it's been a year and a half since the verdict. I had the luxury of time to pull it all the chronology together. And the trial is about the last roughly third of the book. And it's a trial procedure. I think it's actually kind of several reviews have said, that the last 100 pages are just page turn. Because it's just such a compelling trial. But I talked to more than 200 people, many of whom had never given interviews, and some of whom had never given book interviews, including Creighton Waters and Mark Tinsley, Blanca Simpson, the housekeeper.
Oh my God, the housekeeper. See, these are all the questions I want to ask you.
Yes, and she's fantastic. And Blanca, people that we allow in our homes. Do you remember when she was testifying? It sticks with me to this day. She was talking about Alex clothing.
Yes.
Or my muscle memory would go, well, that shirt would have been on this shelf. And then she pretends like she's opening the drawer because she knows where things go. Blanca told me, I can remember sitting with her. I had a little house in Hampton that I'd rented. And she came over and we were sitting there talking, and she started talking. She's like, do you remember the towel? And I was like, I don't know what you're talking about with the towel. And she started telling me that when she first saw Daniel Green, the first officer on the scene, when she first saw his body cam, he's walking up to the bodies. He walks up and you see Alex, and Alex is like, this is a long story. My son was in a boat wreck, and all the 911, all the body cam stuff is going on. And the officer's eye lands for just 2 seconds on the interior of the Suburban, the doors open. And she told her husband, she's like, pause it. Pause it, back it up. And they played it over and over again. And in her mind, until that moment in the trial, she didn't think he did it. She couldn't let herself think he did it. But when she saw this towel, there was a towel that was wadded up in the Suburban between his seat and the console. And it was a beach towel. And it was blue with a green print. She goes, I had just washed that towel and folded it and put it on the top of the laundry shelf for Maggie to take back to Edisto on her next trip down. She knew that towel was freshly laundered. And she said she realized that in her mind, he must have come in the house after having hosed himself off after killing them, gone straight into the laundry room, which is right at that first door as you come in, grabbed a clean shirt, because he insisted that his t-shirts be ironed. So she would wash them, do a specific order of fabric softener, and then hang them, and then iron them, and then put them away. He must have taken a t-shirt that was hanging on the drying rack, grabbed that towel, and then gone and gotten the rest of his clothes. And that was what convinced her that he did it. Isn't that incredible? But
that is, it's always in the details.
She's like, because she cleaned his Suburban was a train wreck, and there was always, you can see in the video, there's like spit cups in there from tobacco, and there's, sunflower seed bags and just garbage everywhere. So she cleaned it out every week. She goes, never in all these years, more than a decade, actually more like 15 years, had she ever, had a wet beach towel in his car ever. Mm. There's no reason for it to be there.
But what about the housekeeper who died suspiciously?
Gloria Satterfield. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Like that to me is like, something.
Well, and the thing, we have the benefit. Alec was so trusted by the family. He gets to Moselle right after the ambulance leaves, he follows the ambulance to the hospital in Walterboro, which is about 30 minutes away. And then they realize how badly she's hurt, and they load her onto the helicopter. And he's there, and he's such a close ally of the family. They're like, can you take the purse back to her sons? He carries the purse. I mean, can you imagine being that close to her? And, they were so close. Paul loved her like his own mother. He was devastated when she died. I do not think there's any chance that, and most people that I interviewed for the book don't think Paul pushed her down the stairs. I think it's fairly, and several people I interview in the family and among her lawyers, she was in poor health. She was 57, and she had many of the diseases of the working poor, like diabetes and all manner of health problems. And she had been having some health episodes that week. She had been faint, and she'd had a little fender bender, and it's possible that she had some sort of medical event, a stroke or fainting or something, and fell down the stairs. I think that's much more likely.
And what about Stephen Smith?
Stephen Smith is the big question mark. That's the 19-year-old young man who was found in the middle of the road back in summer of 2015. And oddly, it was a road, it's called Sandy Run Road now, but it's known as the Crocketville Road. And it was the person that paid to pave it as a civic project back in the 1900s was Randolph Murdaugh Sr.
There you go. All roads lead back to the Murdaughs.
All roads lead back to the Murdaughs. They really do. Stephen Smith, the grand jury is still meeting on that. There's some chance we will know something in the coming months or years, and there's some chance we never will. But Buster Murdaugh was a classmate of Stephen's. They knew each other. Buster has been rumored for years in the police reports and everything else to have been involved in his death, possibly in a Jeep that hit him late at night. The mirror of one of these big Jeeps hit him in the head and the side of the night and killed him. Buster's been adamant he had nothing to do about it. And even he's gone so far this summer as to sue Netflix and HBO and Investigation Discovery over alleging or implicating or insinuating that he did. He's suing for defamation, which is it's going to keep Buster in the news for years to come, and also has the it was somewhat surprising that he decided to bring that lawsuit because it opens him up to deposition, in which he will have to answer, where were you on the night that Stephen Smith died? What happened to your dad's money? Do you know if there's offshore accounts? I mean, he has to answer every question. And so it is somewhat surprising. He's very upset and personally upset and hurt that he's been linked to Stephen Smith's death. But there's a cost to him to bringing this action.
Yeah. Wow. Well, I that just always felt like it hadn't been properly investigated, whether it has anything to do.
Oh, no, it absolutely had not. It was a hot potato that nobody wanted. And in that case, so for that reason, it stayed. Nobody touched it for years. No. And whether it's connected to this family or not, it is a sin. And that family and that mother, they deserve justice, and they deserve to find out what happened here. And if it connects back to this family, I don't know the answer to that, but there's got to be more to this. Something's not right here. Something's just not right. Wow. This is, Valerie, before I go, any other Easter eggs you want to go? Because otherwise I'd be talking to you for the next hour. No, there's so many. I think that that Blanca has a lot to say. I did have the only interviews with David Owen, the SLED agent, who had several things to say about Bubba the dog and the chicken that was in Bubba's mouth, and just his impressions of Alec. And I had long interviews with Dick Carpootlian and with Creighton Waters. And I spent many hours with Mark Tinsley and the Beach family, Hakeem Pinckney's family. I really hope that people that followed the case will find something new over and over again in this book. And I'd be honored if they read it.
Absolutely. I'm going to ask you an absolutely silly question, because it's one that we've all argued about, the pronunciation of Alec and
it's a shockingly hard question, because if you think about it, he code switches. He even uses his own name at different moments. On the 911 call, he pronounces it one way. On the stand, he pronounced it a different way. In Hampton, he is known as Alex Murdaugh. And that's an old Scotch-Irish pronunciation. A lot of Alexes in South Carolina are Alec.
Wow. Thank you for that, because honestly, I've been losing my mind trying to get this right. And every time I think I have it, I hear another pronunciation.
No, it's not an easy question at all. And you're smart to ask it.
Oh, thank you. Well, Valerie, this has been such a pleasure to have you. Fantastic.
Well, please have me back sometime. I really enjoyed it. I really did.
Absolutely, Valerie, without question. Please, your book, where is it available? All that good stuff.
The Devil at His Elbow, Alex Murdaugh and the Fall of the Southern Dynasty. Your local bookstore, Amazon. Please find it out. It's 480 pages. You'll learn something. I sure hope.
And Valerie, where can people follow you on social media if you have a website or anything?
Sure. Yeah, I'm still a national affairs reporter for the Wall Street Journal, so I'm still publishing news articles there. And then my Twitter is @VBauerlein, and my Instagram handle is @Valerie.Bauerlein.
Terrific. Thank you. I'm Anna G. News. You can find all our social media at My True Crime News. This podcast, all our podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel and also sign up for our newsletter at truecrimenews.com. So until next time, this is Ana Garcia for True Crime News, the podcast. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.